Hello. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. Grateful for you all to be here today. This is a topic that we weren't necessarily sure who all would come and wanted to acknowledge, like as a starting point, that as we're looking at some of the narratives that have been uplifted in reference to October 7th in particular, one of the big things that folks have wrestled with has been the question of like, and that's even one that when we were talking about having this as our venue, there were some questions of like, well, are you advocating for violence or not? So we just wanted to briefly speak to and some of what I've been thinking about is, as I've been reading Struggle Makes Us Human by Vijay Prashad, this notion of like, where do we stand lives that are considered disposable or precious, and the ways in which many times we uplift like this notion of like and know that there are like ways within my formation that it seems much easier to think about nonviolence as like a strategy, and yet recognizing also that as Vijay Prashad talks about, like a civilization that tolerates high levels of hunger among people is a violent civilization, right? The impetus for violence is rooted in the civilization. And so when looking within the context of not only do we need to think more like historically of what circumstances that have led up to this, but also how do we understand that there is structural violence that is at the root. And so acts of violence, as this book uplifts, but as many others have spoken to, acts of violence are often inevitable when the circumstances are violent and you have no other opportunity. There's a Haitian scholar who talks about this like saying in Haiti where a dog into the car, it would bite. So, you know, just wanting to start that as one of the consider when we're looking at October 7th, understanding that custom brigades are majority. And so when the Israeli occupation forces have killed the family of almost all of the people in the military brigade, it makes sense that the response to like crushing violence systemically is to look for whatever is possible. And there have been so many attempts by Palestinians to offer violent solutions that have been met with violence as well. Just wanting to uplift that and really hold. Yeah, it is very possible to believe in nonviolence as a strategy, desire, and cannot separate the like violent structural society in which everything I will leave it there for now, but grateful for you all to be here, and I'll pass it back to Keegan.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for being here on a really gorgeous Sunday afternoon. What's up, summer? Yeah, again, my name is Keegan. Chad, you want to hit the next slide, my friend? Awesome. So just logistically, if you've never been in this building, the restroom is just out the door to the left. Yeah, down the hallway. Thank you to those of us, those of y'all joining us from home or from wherever else on Zoom. The Albuquerque Antiwar Coalition is a group that has been around for about 5 years, predominantly doing political education, both online, in person, or both in this case, and in the case of a couple events that we had earlier this spring and late winter. And we're really grateful for you to be here to talk about some hard stuff that has you know, immense relevance for the ongoing genocide in Gaza as well as the regional ramifications of all those things that are happening. In that vein, we feel it really important to acknowledge this is day 226 of the acute genocide happening right now in Gaza at the hands of Israel, but also all of the international partners of Israel who support that, including most notably the United States, providing political cover, providing arms and ammunition, money, and diplomatic support. So yeah, just want to note that. Next slide. Thanks, Che. We want to make a couple notes for those here and also listening online that this presentation, due to the nature of what we're talking about, is going to include some frank descriptions of violence, including alleged sexual violence. There is also going to be a couple videos that have some distressing content, nothing super graphic, but we'll give everyone a heads up before that's about to happen. We also want to make a note that in putting together this presentation, we did our best to kind of adhere to, I guess, what would be the kind of standard journalistic practice in terms of what you can bring together to bear as evidence to actually support something. So that means we're not just using eyewitness accounts. If there's an eyewitness account that we're using, it's corroborated by video evidence or by other people or something. It's not just someone who says something that happened, which we'll point out is a real problem in some of the narratives that Israel has been pushing. We're also, we'll be sending a follow-up email with sources for everyone who registered and for people here, if they're interested in the sources that you can go to read these things in more depth and kind of do the journalism that, I don't know, journalism, but the research and investigation that we were able to do on the standards of, on the shoulders of a lot of people who have been doing this work for many years, but particularly in the last 6 months of this genocide have been doing really excellent work. Putting forward stories that mainstream media is not willing to put together. Next slide, please, Che. So yeah, again, the goal of this is to talk about lies and distortions about the things that happened on October 7th, 2023, because those lies and distortions not only were used initially to justify what is now, again, this over half of a year-long genocide, but also continue to be raised by our politicians, the people in our media, as recently as a few days ago or last week, in the case of House Speaker Mike Johnson, in the case of our President Joe Biden, to continue to justify what's happening there. It's a lineage of atrocity propaganda, perpetrated by imperial powers, again, most notably the United States, in the vein of Libya, where we toppled the government of Muammar Gaddafi. And one of the things that helped fuel the sort of the manufactured consent to make people not outraged about that was saying ridiculous things that I'm actually not going to mention here because they're really graphic, but just were demonstrably false. As well as in Iraq in the early 2000s, literally destroying an entire country on the lie that there were weapons of mass destruction there. And we want to, also say up front that without like an independent third-party investigation into what happened on October 7th, we'll probably never be able to say exactly all of the things that did happen, but we can point to things that very verifiably either have absolutely no evidence. So sure, you could say it, but there's no great way to defend the fact that actually happened. And we can also say things that have been demonstrably disproven, that again continue to get raised. Yeah, next slide. Thanks, Jeff. So curious for folks either online or in person. Yeah, some of the things that you had heard about what happened on October 7th, 2023, it feels like a long time ago, but was really, whatever, 6 or 7 or 8 months ago. You can just shout it out. You can type it on the chat if you're on Zoom. But yeah, I'll just give a minute or so to see if there's anything that people have to say.
Five.
Yeah, so someone just mentioned the fact that babies are beheaded. Initially, there was like a lot of news articles, like 40 beheaded babies or dozens of beheaded babies. That was one thing that was said. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else that sort of stuck in folks' minds that they keep being heard repeating? It doesn't have to necessarily be atrocity propaganda. This could also just be things that they heard happened. Yeah, there was a music festival that was near the edge of Gaza that got caught in a crossfire. Yeah. Claims of mass and systematic sexual violence, particularly against women, by Hamas. Anything else coming to folks' minds? Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. We'll be talking about pretty much all of those things today. Awesome. Can you go to the next slide, Jim? So we thought it would be nice to, nice is actually not the right word, but it would be illustrative to listen to our President Joe Biden say what he thinks happened on October 7th. And this was like about a week and a half ago, I think, May 9th. And I'm playing this clip, Jay. Gotta wait for the ad. Lol. Hi there, thank you for joining. Just getting the sound to work on the speaker. Well, I could do that. It's long. Uh, 20 seconds.
Outspokenness. That hatred was brought to light on October 7th in 2023. On a sacred Jewish holiday, terrorist group Hamas unleashed the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Driven by ancient desire to wipe out the Jewish people off the face of the earth, over 1,200 innocent people, babies, parents, grandparents, slaughtered in their kibbutz, massacred at a music festival, brutally raped, mutilated, and sexually assaulted. Thousands more carrying wounds, bullets and shrapnel from the member.
So the key claims of that sort of rant are some of the things that we just mentioned, which are, the first one is that 1,200 innocent people were slaughtered. The second one is that this was the the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. The third is that a number of babies were killed. And the fourth is that widespread and systemic sexual violence, assault, and mutilation happened. Jay, can you hit the next slide, please? We can go to the next one. So before we kind of basically debunk those things, we just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that UC was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, which is that history did not start on October 7th. And that when you speak to people in Hamas or the other Palestinian resistance factions that participated in the military action on that day, and also other people in Gaza and other interested people in the region, whether they're allies in Yemen or Lebanon, is that there were some pretty clear reasons why October 7th happened. One was that Saudi Arabia has been seeking to normalize with Israel for a long time. And this is relevant because Saudi Arabia is a very important regional power in the Middle East. And if Saudi Arabia, part of the normalization with Israel would be recognizing it as a state. It has not recognized Israel as a state since 1948. But if it does, a lot of people in Palestine, Hamas included, and other Palestinian resistance movements included, feel like that would be a death knell for the ability of Palestine to have its own state in the future, or to ever have kind of any kind of self-determination, because a very powerful Arab country is now like essentially an ally of Israel. That normalization would also include a nuclear program for Saudi Arabia, and as I said, Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel. Another reason, I mean, endless list of reasons, is the 75 years of, less acute genocide, through periods that were almost as acute as what is happening right now. Land theft, dispossession, sexual assault, the list is very long. And so just wanted to, obviously I think everyone in this room knows that, but it's important to remember that like this didn't happen in a vacuum. And if you listen to the State Department briefings or press conferences with the White House, the spokespeople there are, every time they get asked about the violence that's happening in Gaza and all the people who are being murdered there, the first thing they say is, well, do you remember what happened on October 7th? And so it's almost as if history for those people started on October 7th, and we just need to really, really make it clear that it didn't. Next slide, please, Jeff. A little bit about the goals of October 7th, in terms of, these are the goals that are explicit in a Hamas document, but they're also, analysts think they're shared by the other resistance factions that were part of that day. The biggest goal was to get hostages, particularly from the Israeli military, in order to trigger a prisoner exchange. A number of thousand, I think it was around 5,000 at the beginning of this, and it's now closer to 7,000 or 8,000, I think. But it's definitely at least 5,000 Palestinian people are held by Israel. And a number of these people are political prisoners, people who, if they came back into Palestine, would have a lot of political power and would be helpful in supporting the dreams of a Palestinian state or Palestinian self-determination. And in the past, Palestinian resistance factions have been able to use hostages from Israel to exchange for many hundreds of Palestinian people. And in one case, there were, I think, about 500 Palestinians for one Israeli soldier. And so the goal was to get a bunch of Israeli soldiers so that they could get their people home. That's one of the main goals. Another goal was to destroy Israeli military and intelligence infrastructure, which they succeeded at, which we'll go into in a second. And the third was that a lot of senior officials in Hamas felt that Palestinian self-determination was kind of being left by the wayside and was not really an issue for a lot of the international community anymore. And they wanted to put that back on the international stage and make it clear that they needed to have self-determination and would not, slowly die in an open-air concentration camp. Next slide, please. So I'm going to click that video chat. I know this is kind of clunky, but it's annoying. I can just talk through it. Okay, cool. Well, then we'll just talk a little bit about how the day kind of like unfolded. So at 6:30 in the morning, a military operation led by Hamas, but also, again, there were okay, we're gonna want to go to 11:39 if we can. That's perfect. So this is just going to show a little bit how the day started.
It's one of at least 10 breaches in the fence. Thousands of rockets are fired into Israel. paragliders cross the fence. Hamas uses boats to attack targets north of the Gaza Strip.
What is impressive about it is that there were a lot of synchronized things that needed to happen for it to succeed. There's some very low-tech features up against, probably the most high-tech sort of military machine anywhere out there.
Not even particularly sophisticated ones took out a lot of the radar, the sensor that was placed on top of what was the tower, took out communications nodes that were placed along the border, so that in effect they blinded the Southern Command from the get-go.
Cool, we can stop. So, thank you so much, Yael, for dealing with the tech. So just wanted to show a little bit about like the fact this is actually a fairly sophisticated military operation. It wasn't just a bunch of, as I think is sort of portrayed either implicitly or explicitly, like a bunch of barbarians raiding across a border to rape and pillage. The targets initially were military, police, security, and other intelligence infrastructure. And also, as they mentioned, a number of breaches were, a number of holes were blown in the wall, in the concentration camp prison wall. And so after a couple hours of the Hamas attack, during which they really overwhelmed the Israeli military installations, there were a couple things that happened. One is that Israel's ability to know what was happening there, given kind of what the gentleman at the very end of there described, was basically nothing. They were overrun. A lot of the initial hostages were soldiers or commanders in those regions from the IDF. And so people who were in the Israeli military who were being asked to respond were going to the south near where Gaza was and asking what to do, and no one had an answer. So that was the first thing that happened, is that the Israeli military was in complete disarray. The second thing that happened is thousands of other people who are not affiliated with Hamas or other Palestinian resistance groups poured through the walls of their prison. As we'll go into a little bit later, it's very difficult to know who did what in terms of like, there was looting, there were definitely like people killed who were unarmed, there were people thrown out of cars, like there's all kinds of mayhem that happened. And there's a lot that is being in the narratives by the United States and Israel completely put on Palestinian people or the Palestinian militant resistance movements, that you cannot demonstrably say that those things happened. Cool, we can go to the next slide. So we'll get to kind of the first big claim, which is that 1,200 people, innocent people, were killed. First of all, it's actually, it's not accurate to say that. Let's see, 256 soldiers, Israeli soldiers, were part of this 1,200. Police and security forces were also part of this number, and other civilian security guards, people at the Nova Music Festival, and security guards who were part of the kibbutzim were among those killed. So to just go up and say 1,200 innocent people were murdered is not at all an accurate characterization of what happened that day. It also doesn't have the understanding that a lot of these people died fighting. This is not like people were it's not like all these people were lined up and executed or something, right? This is like was a very chaotic incident. As I said, and we'll get to in a second, the Israeli ability to understand what was going on was completely compromised. So there were helicopter pilots that were literally on like telephones calling people on WhatsApp groups asking like, where should I shoot? As an example of the degree to which their command and control, their ability to understand what's happening on the battlefield, was compromised. Another thing that Luna actually helped point out last night is that the unarmed civilian section of this graph does not include a number of people who may have been combatants. So this includes people who are in the settlements. So in addition to a number of the military installations that were attacked, settlements also got attacked. And a number of people in settlements are required to carry weapons, and so it's a confusing line where to say who is a civilian and who is a combatant when you're in that kind of a, particularly for adults, right, who are in that context. And also a number of these people are reservists in the Israeli military. This is, I'm not arguing, and I don't think we want to say that no unarmed people were killed, but it's difficult to say that all of these unarmed people, A, were unarmed, because we don't have video footage of all of them, and B, were not somehow fighting back, just as combatants. And so this is all before the fact that potentially a lot of people who were killed that day were killed by Israeli friendly fire. But so even before we get to that point, Joe Biden going up 2 weeks ago saying that 1,200 people were murdered it's just a lie, and it continues to feed the consent for people to say, oh, well, this was horrible, so I guess that people, we got to get Hamas in Gaza. Cool. Next slide, please, Chen. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
That higher up Israeli admin or whatever did know about the plans for the Hamas attack, and that certain personnel were threatened with losing their job or whatnot for exposing them.
Yeah, the question is that there is maybe some evidence to suggest that people that were high up in the Israeli command knew of the October 7th attack, and you're saying may have been threatened or kind of coerced into allowing it to happen?
The people that were saying it looks like there's an attack about to happen, and they saw these plans for months. They lost their jobs or threatened that they would lose their job.
Right.
So Israel did nothing, but I thought there was evidence that Israel did know. So maybe their military was compromised, but I'm just saying that I thought there was evidence that really that responsibility was Israel's lack of, intentional, ignoring what people were saying or something.
Right. So for folks on Zoom, someone's question is kind of around there is evidence to suggest that people in the Israeli government knew this was going to happen and threatened people who were like, oh, we should do something about it to stop it from happening. Is that an accurate characterization? Sorry, of course. Yeah. So from my perspective, and this is just my investigation, I was unable to find because I saw similar things that Hamas's training exercises for months were fairly indicative that this might happen. There's some evidence that intelligence was shared with the Israeli military that this was going to happen. But I personally wasn't able to reach any particular conclusion about that. There's certainly some evidence to suggest that. That's in my experience. And Luna, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that I just want to say one other thing. The 1,200 number, that's the revised number after the 1,700 number that was kind of that was a narrative for a long time. My only thing about this is that there is evidence about this, and I saw some experts or journalists talk about how potentially there was kind of an attitude of pretentiousness, oh, they would never actually be able to pull this off. This is not a big deal, nothing to worry about. We know something's going to happen, but it does not rise to the degree of having to do something about it. And then I also have seen that potentially it's unclear how far spread that knowledge went.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, there's some of the analysts that I've read disagree about this. Some are like, oh, this was intentionally repressed so that it could happen, so that they could then justify what they're now doing in Gaza. Some people are saying, no, this came from more of a hubris, oh, this would never work. As early as 1 or 2 a.m. that morning, some activity on the Gaza side of the border gave Israeli military intelligence some pause, and they called some people in and were like, hey, should we do anything about this? And their response was, oh, it's probably a training exercise. Let's check it back in the morning. And when they checked back in the morning, it was already happening. But so, yeah, unfortunately, there's not a clear answer to that, but it's certainly possible. Cool. Any other questions or comments as we move forward? Yeah.
What is the number of hostages, and was it included in that deal, pie chart?
The number of hostages was not. Oh yeah, exactly. No, the number of hostages was not included in that pie chart. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. I remember it being a couple hundred, but does anyone remember?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, between 1 and 200, something like that is my memory, but I don't want to put 10 toes down on that. So I want to read a sort of illuminating piece from a part of a paragraph from a Israeli newspaper. So this is from Ynet, which is a really enormous media organization, and it's like one of their biggest newspapers, kind of like the New York Times or Washington Post in Israel. And they say this as in response to the IDF saying that they probably killed some Israelis on October 7th. So the quote is, "Casualties happened as a result of friendly fire on October 7th, but the IDF believes that beyond the operational investigations of the events, it would not be morally sound to investigate these incidents due to the," this is what I want to emphasize, "due to the immense and complex quantity of them being friendly fire incidents." So again, due to the immense and complex quantity of friendly fire incidents that took place in the kibbutzim and southern Israeli communities due to the challenging situations the soldiers were in at the time. So there are a number of Israeli military officials, soldiers, helicopter pilots, who have admitted that they were not 100% always sure what they were shooting at. And some of these people were in Apache helicopters, which are shooting, machine guns that fire hundreds of rounds per second, or missiles. And so I think this is just a really illuminating kind of admission from the Israeli military that we don't really see much in US media. There's an interesting dichotomy where Israeli media is a lot more critical of the Israeli army due to the fact, not from the same perspective that we probably are, but because they feel ashamed or because they failed that day. And it's interesting that some of these things were coming out in December, in November even, and have not been reported widely in the US media. And so again, part of the reason we felt that we wanted to do a talk like this is because a lot of people that I know in my community are still saying, yes, it's horrible what's happening in Gaza, but remember what Hamas did on October 7th. No. Yeah, exactly. And we'll get to that in just a second. Yeah, next slide, Chet. Thank you for bringing that up. So let's see. The Hannibal Directive is something that is also described by analysts who kind of look at this day and see what was going on from the Israeli perspective. The Hannibal Directive initially was an informal, I'll just read the quote, it's an informal protocol that says that we, being Israel, prefers that a soldier be killed rather than taken alive. This is related to what I was mentioning earlier, that Palestinian resistance groups had previously been able to use very small numbers of Israeli soldiers to trade for very large numbers of Palestinian prisoners. And it appears that Israel cares more about not releasing Palestinian prisoners than its own civilians, its own people, or even its own soldiers. This protocol was said to be kind of shut down in the early 2000s, but there's a lot of evidence, including multiple Israeli military sources saying that on about noon of October 7th, this was revised. And that it was sort of blanket applied to all units, all people who are responding, we don't want to let Israeli people get into Gaza. So you can go to the next slide, Shin. I want to remind folks that the Israeli Defense Forces were in complete disarray. Its Gaza command was basically non-functional. And some orders were put out to not allow any people into Israel or into Gaza or out of Gaza. And so cars that may have had a couple Palestinian resistance fighters and a couple of hostages, or people fleeing the Nova Music Festival, it's really hard to say. There's a lot of distressing video that we didn't include of Apache helicopter. It's kind of that green video with like the target, just like shooting at things that we cannot tell what, like those are people, those are cars. It's impossible at this distance and without the kind of control that they they lost on the ground to say who is happening. So as you mentioned, ma'am, the Hamas and other Palestinian resistance factions were armed with mostly light weaponry. So that's like machine guns, handguns, and light, like rocket propelled grenades, things that will hurt humans a lot and can damage like the sides of buildings, but will not like level buildings, cannot cause catastrophic structural damage to buildings. And grenades, which similarly will blow a hole in a wall, but not cause a building to collapse. If you look at the videos of a lot of the kibbutzim on October 10th, 11th, 12th, there are whole blocks and houses that are like leveled or partially destroyed. Similarly, you'll see a lot of footage of things like this, like these cars are absolutely destroyed. And military analysts from different perspectives, not the same ideological perspective, but from Israel, from United States, people who aren't even really party to the conflict, are like, there's no way that machine guns or even grenades did this level of damage. As I mentioned earlier, the IDF was using like WhatsApp groups and other really informal means to like say, hey, 3 houses away from that water tower, we need that shot because that's where terrorists are. And again, without like a independent third-party investigation, it's very, very difficult to say of those 1,200 people, okay, so some were soldiers, some were police fighting, some were security officers, who were killed by Israeli friendly fire, who were killed by Hamas, who were killed by Israeli, not friendly fire, but cynical destruction of people due to the Hannibal Directive to prevent them from being hostages in Gaza. And so just to go back to the initial claim that Joe Biden made a week and a half ago, it just falls apart under scrutiny. You just cannot in any kind of ethical sense say that 1,200 people were slaughtered that day. 1,200 people died, many in horrible ways, but the lines are not at all clear. Awesome. Any questions or comments before we move on to the next claim? Cool.
The refusal to look into it, the very far, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of the UN has offered on multiple occasions to come in and do a kind of an independent investigation that Israel has refused on multiple occasions and in multiple contexts. I don't know about the cars being buried, but yeah, they're not forthcoming about information. Yeah. Should we go to the next slide? Thank you. This, kind of one of the most sort of like heinous claims, like a really awful thing that babies were like intentionally murdered, is really easy to disprove. It's distressing because, like, as we mentioned, people were saying that babies were beheaded, that they were burned, that they were put in ovens. Mike Johnson, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, was talking about how the Hamas terrorists put babies in ovens on that day. There was one that a baby was cut out of their mother's belly. And the video is actually so short that I think I'll just go through what it says, that a number of different journalism outfits have done an independent kind of full accounting of the people who were killed that day, of all the people who died. And there are only two people who are infants. And it's horrible, right? One of them died because a bullet came through a door and they were there. And one of them died during an emergency cesarean section. So both tragedies, but none of them matching these descriptions, and there were only 2. So to say, again, this far into the genocide that that babies were burned, that they were piled together, all these like really awful things are it's just a lie. Like it's just false. And Luna will get a little bit into an organization called Zaka that has kind of provided a lot of these claims, and why, in addition to the forensic evidence not lining up, it's really worth questioning claims that they'd make based on previous claims that they've made. But so yeah, this is just not true. Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
That not only is it untrue, but after almost a year of watching the genocide unfold, it's pure projection. Because we've actually seen some of these things happen to Palestinians, literally on our phones.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a certain type of people to not only lie, but to willingly lie about things that you have committed yourself. Yeah, everything is really, really dark.
Yeah, so the comment, if folks weren't able to hear on Zoom, is that not only are the things that were, particularly about infants and babies, lies, but in some ways they're like projection, given the things that we've actually demonstrably seen on our phones in terms of babies being left in incubators and the, scrolling through your feed and seeing dead children every day. And that it's an acute kind of evil to not only lie about it, but then to actually perpetrate it. Did I cover that? Okay, thanks, Mandy. Awesome. Okay, I think I'm gonna pass it over to Luna here to talk about the other two claims.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, Marty, because bombs burn people's skin. So all the kids who've been bombed have been burned. So I'm gonna talk about this claim that we actually heard in that Joe Biden video. This is the deadliest attack since the Holocaust on Jewish people. This is the American Jewish Committee. This is on their website as of last night. It says, on October 7th, Hamas terrorists waged the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Can you go to the next slide? So I don't know why they are saying this, because it's so, if you just Google search this, it just comes up right away. The dirty wars of Argentina. This happened from 1974 to 1983. This was a US-backed militian junta, which essentially means like military is like running a government as if it's like a governing body. And they formed what was called the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, AAA. And they're, at the time in Argentina, there was a very large population, a small population of Jewish people, but of the communists, a large percentage of them were Jewish. So when they came and they killed a lot of communists, disproportionately, they killed a lot of Jewish people. This was US-backed and it was Israeli-backed. Can you go to the next slide? So yeah, the lowest estimate is 1,300. The highest estimate is 3,000 deaths of Jewish people. And this is a quote from Kosofam. Jews represented more than 12% of the victims of the military regime, while constituting under 1% of Argentina's population.
Israel funded killing Jews in Argentina?
Yes, so that's the next thing. Can you actually go back to the last slide? So at the bottom here in 2016, I think it was Israelis who did a FOIA to find out, because they knew Israel was somehow involved, but they didn't know exactly what. So this is very recent information, 2016. So Israel, and this bottom line that I'm about to read is an Israeli article called, like, I think ends the 259 or 257, the number, whatever. But it's an Israeli magazine that put this out in 2016. Israel, according to many testimonies, maintained ties with the dictatorship of Argentina, aiding it with weapons and military training. So what that means is that Israel was complicit in the actual deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And sorry, they maintained ties, they aided it with weapons and military training in Argentina. Exactly, yeah. Can you go to the next one, and then the next one after this as well? So I'm going to talk about these claims of mass sexual violence, and one of the main perpetrators of this, as Keegan was talking about, like, I'm really interested in thinking about like the media and how the media, even like liberal media, is like very just a vehicle for like ruling class ideology. So this is the New York Times published this a couple months ago, Screams Without Words. It was a huge piece that actually was one of the main pieces referenced to continue the genocide. It really helped justify this ongoing genocide. And to this day, this one piece, it hasn't been retracted. Nothing has been edited in it except for like one little tiny copy edit. Nothing, they haven't taken it down, and it's caused internally a lot of strife, but also externally, with journalists being like, journalists and professors of journalism and, independent experts saying, what, this is completely fabricated. Like almost nothing in this piece is true.
Is that what they want to vote for?
Is it what they won their Pulitzer for? Okay, well, that's absurd. So can you go to the next one? Oh, if that's what they won their Pulitzer for, and then Keegan says, yes, I was not aware of that. Can you go to the next slide, Chet? Okay, so let me read this. A 2-month investigation by the Times uncovered painful new details, establishing that the attacks against women were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of gender-based violence on October 7th. Relying on video footage, photographs, GPS data from mobile phones, and interviews with more than 150 people, including witnesses, medical personnel, soldiers, and rape counselors, the Times identified at least 7 locations where Israeli women and girls appear to have been sexually assaulted or mutilated. So the central story of this article was that there was a woman who's Israeli named Gal Abdush, saying that they said that she was killed, and they said that she was a victim of rape. And so that was like the central story. They also alleged that there was, as you can see, mass sexual assault, a pattern done by Hamas fighters, and then other really graphic claims that have come from these same eyewitnesses, quote unquote eyewitnesses, have claimed that, and this is graphic, so I apologize. There was public rape. Women were raped with objects such as wood planks and iron rods. Bodies were burned after being raped, and bodies were mutilated. And in the Joe Biden clip that we just watched, he says all of these things. So literally not, Israel has not identified a single survivor of the alleged mass rapes on the 7th of October. And they also have not provided a single credible eyewitness. And that's the main issue with this article. Completely is against journalistic standards to do this. If an independent journalist did this, it would be the end of their career. You can go to the next slide. So these are the 5 main issues with the story. The first is that it lacks evidence. So Abdush, this is the woman who was killed and she was allegedly raped. Her family has repudiated the claim. They say that there's no evidence that she was raped. This is her own mother and sister. And they claim that they were manipulated by the New York Times and had no idea that the newspaper was going to use their loved one to further the rape narrative, despite the lack of any evidence that it occurred. The second issue is that the eyewitnesses lack credibility. So in this piece, the New York Times identifies 4 eyewitnesses, and one's a woman and the other 3 are men. And the woman doesn't have her last name. They just use her first name. So in journalistic newsrooms, that means that this went through several editors are supposed to check on the credibility of these eyewitnesses. I don't know if that process happened, but their stories are very inherently unlikely or impossible. I think you can, without going into it, I think you could probably imagine why some of these claims are unlikely. There's a total lack of corroboration, including bodies and other physical and forensic evidence, or because the supposed witnesses have changed their stories over time. And all of these eyewitnesses have changed their stories over time, which is a journalistic malpractice again. So the third is that there's no forensic evidence. So the Times investigation and other investigations from Washington Post, CNN, and Haaretz, the Times of Israel, they do not confirm the existence of victims or physical or forensic evidence. And it provides a litany of excuses for why there is no forensic evidence or crime scene photos. Anat Schwartz, the writer of this piece, called every clinic that would have received bodies to see if there were bodies with signs of sexual assault and could not come up with any proof. The fourth is that the video evidence. Hello, welcome. So despite Israel saying that there are tens of thousands of videos filmed on the 7th of October, authorities have not claimed that a single one of them shows a rape or sexual assault taking place. And then the last one is Zaka. So Zaka it's like, I guess, called a nonprofit, if you can call it that. And it's been like all of the like last things that Keegan was talking about, the beheaded babies, burned babies, they made up all of that. So all of those have now come out to be untrue. And they're also the main eyewitness of all of this like sexual assault stories is someone who works at Zaka. And Zaka has been like really instrumental in these New York Times the article.
I heard of something called black dress related to this, what's that?
The red dress?
Black dress.
Well, I don't know what black dress is.
I think that is God.
Okay, I thought it was red dress, but yeah, that's the woman who was like the main thing of the whole article. That was her. She was, I guess, the woman in the black dress.
I heard this was discredited in Israel, but we, in this country, stuff against Israel gets friends.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of these have been discredited in Israel. So the last thing is that today, in electronic intifada piece, and this is where I get most of my like my sources, they published a piece saying that one of the main Israeli human rights groups that was really pushing this narrative, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, they had for months used as a talking point this systemic campaign of sexual violence, but they just published a piece walking it all back. So before in November, they had said, it's becoming more apparent that the violence perpetrated against women, men, and children also included widespread sexual and gender-based crimes. But now they published something that says, in the extensive investigations conducted in the months following the publication of the position paper in November, some testimonies referenced within it have been disputed or deemed unverifiable, and more may face similar scrutiny in the future. So that again is like this nonprofit, this human rights group in Israel called Physicians for Human Rights Israel. They said, we regret their inclusion in the position paper. Yeah, so, and I believe that was Ryan Grimm. I think he's at The Intercept or something, but so yeah, I think that the main, I think takeaway for me, just like, Iraq and Cuba and pretty much every single time we've ever invaded a country or we've ever had some kind of horrible geopolitical policy in a third world country or any country in the world, the New York Times has consistently created like a whole bunch of narratives that are unverifiable and would be considered complete journalistic malpractice if done by an independent journalist or an independent journalism outfit. But when they do it, they get away with it. No one, they get a Pulitzer Prize for it. It just, life goes on. Yeah, Marnie.
I just want to mention the projection again, and just want to say that historically, it's the occupying armies that commit these types of crimes. Yeah. Historically, it isn't the actual people of the land. When there's combat of war, it's usually the occupying forces that commit these types of crimes.
So for people on Zoom, the comment was that historically the occupying power force is the one that commits these kinds of crimes, and that's completely true. The United Nations actually, again, I think that one of the other main takeaways of this is like we need a objective, if that's possible, somewhat objective third-party account of everything that has happened on both sides since October 7th or before. And that hasn't taken place, and it seems like it will not take place. And the United Nations, which many of us, believe is close to some kind of third party, they could do some of this stuff, has not found any evidence for mass sexual violence in terms of Hamas fighters or Palestinians on October 7th, but it has found a lot of evidence for women in women and men in detention centers who have undergone rape and other kinds of sexual violence. So again, I think it's apt, this idea that the projection, all allegations or all like accusations are projections.
Arguing with someone the other night who was convinced there was a UN report confirming this. And I was really trying to persuade him of that, but you have a sense like where that's coming from, that he's like, there's a UN report saying that Hamas. Yeah, that's the result of it.
I don't know.
There is a UN report that basically like took a lot of the stuff from this story and said, like it didn't exactly rubber stamp it. It did not offer any new evidence. It kind of repeated some of the same things and said like, well, look, there could be some evidence of that. So, which is unfortunate because someone who you're arguing with can say, hey, the UN has done this. And the person who authored this report has faced enormous criticism at the hands of most of the other countries in the world, because they're like, this is incredibly irresponsible. Not only did you not say that these things didn't happen, or not only did you say like, listen, you can assert these things, but we cannot prove them. There's just absolutely no forensic evidence for any of this. And yes, it's unfortunate because they gave this person ammunition to say something like that. What you can say if you see them again is that there's no forensic evidence. Like, sure, okay, read the UN report and tell me. They don't assert that any actual, just like Luna said, there's no one incident that they can point to and say this definitely happened. But they kind of regurgitate a lot of the talking points, unfortunately.
And actually, that gets to our next point. Keegan, maybe you want to stay here? Can you go to the next slide? Oh yeah. Are there any questions or comments or anything? You want to go to the next one?
I just want to add, can I add one thing about
Yeah.
Zaka? Yeah. I just want to add one thing about Zaka, the organization that Luna mentioned, which what they are is a group of I guess I don't know exactly how to describe their ideology, but their sort of stated purpose is to find dead Israeli citizens and recover them for a proper Jewish burial. Because of they have a lot of access that like wouldn't normally be afforded just like a kind of a random nonprofit. And so in the past, there has been demonstrated stories where they've lied about like the appearance of something that happens in a way that frames Palestinians or Palestinian militants as being responsible. The leader of the organization has been credibly, I'm not saying that he did this, but has been credibly accused by multiple women of sexual, I forget, some kind of sexual assault and harassment. But the members of that organization, there is video of them sitting on a table with the commanders of that organization sitting with Benjamin Netanyahu, being congratulated because they're part of the he doesn't quite say propaganda war, but he says that the stories that you're bringing are really important for us winning the international community. And so there's like a clear conflict of interest between like the kind of reporting that we would need to say whether or not these things happened and what a group like that can provide in the best of circumstances and certainly in the worst of circumstances where there's credible evidence that there's a lot of cynical behavior. I just want to say that, yeah. And yeah, as we kind of get towards the end, as you mentioned earlier, some of the audience mentioned that like a lot of these things have been reported by Israeli media, being very critical of their government and their military, and that doesn't really make its way across the Atlantic. At least from my perspective, I do not see mainstream media reporting on these types of things, which is really distressing as we're the country providing, again, political support, diplomatic support, ammunition, money, and international cover for this genocide. And then, yeah, just before, we're going to do like a little activity at the end, but we're just curious if anyone has any questions or comments or things that they want to add. Go ahead.
So Zaka is, are they a news organization? No.
No, they're like I don't know how to.
It's a nonprofit, but a lot of what they do is communications. But I would not call that journalism, but they just put out like press statements and then they talk to the press about what they have found. And I think Keegan is right that they like their role is in part like to store the bodies that have been, yeah.
They go on scene to like, they went on scene to kibbutzim and things like that to recover bodies. And a number of them said that they saw these different things, and then when pressed or when asked for video evidence or anything, there's just nothing that they can provide. 100%, yeah, yeah.
And they're the ones who started about the babies and ovens.
A number of the really lurid stories about like babies in ovens, children being, there's one that Benjamin Netanyahu repeated on the phone to Joe Biden about children being stacked and burned alive and bound at the back, which are horrible stories. And there's just, again, there's none of the victims fit those descriptions. There aren't enough children of that age. Like all these things fall apart on kind of closer inquiry.
And also Zaka is founded by a serial rapist, and there is evidence of that.
And have those been publicly like disproven about that? I just wanna know because somebody's arguing with me and I wanna make sure, you know, like, that they can check that it's not true.
Yeah.
The baby specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can, like I said, if you're not registered for the Zoom event, we'll put a paper out for you to write your email, because I'd like to send like the source list essentially that we got, so that you could like be like, you don't even have to listen to me, just watch this Al Jazeera documentary or read this Israeli media piece. That's again not coming from our perspective, from a perspective of being like, we want the war in Gaza to continue because we want to punish Hamas, but the Israeli government did not do right by this, if that makes sense. Cool. Any other sort of comments or questions before we move on to the last piece? Yeah, go ahead.
Different than discerning what is false and what's true, but I along the lines of these lies being projections, I also think it's important to look at them as propaganda. They're really elaborate lies, and they're not just Israeli lies, they're US as well, and I think that's important, that not like mixed up information, or I don't know how many different types of lies there are, but
Right, yeah, the comment is that not only are these sort of like accidentally misinformation, or but it's a systematic propaganda designed to support something that's horrible, and it's a lot of it is cynical, and not just from Israelis but also from the United States. Say again.
it's supporting an imperialist regime.
Right. Yeah, to support the kind of designs of an imperialist regime. Yeah. Thank you all for sitting through what is some distressing stuff to both hear and talk about. Can we go to the next slide, Jay? So we're like a fairly small group. We thought there might be a couple more people here. Luna and I thought it might be kind of fun to role play a conversation between someone who's like asserting that these things happen and didn't. You want to do it, Luna?
Sure. So I guess the idea is like, what if you're having a conversation with a friend or family member who, has like different, how would you like, with this information, like, how would you react? So, okay, let's say you're my friend. I could say, hey, I really appreciate all the like pro-Palestine stuff you're doing. I think that you're going a little bit too in the tank. And I think that the problem is that there actually was so much violence done, and you're kind of, you're really erasing that, and it's really hurtful to me.
Can you say more about like what violence you think happened?
There was like so many atrocities committed, and like there was like thousands of people killed, and like innocent people and women and babies. Like, how can you excuse that? Yeah,
that makes sense. It's like really emotional and like really horrible things that were said. When you look at, I'm just going to say some evidence that I like have seen myself, and you can take it or leave it, but there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that the number of people is not as simple as just saying 1,200 people were murdered. There's a lot of evidence to say that because of the confusing day, and because of some other things that we can talk about if you like, that a lot of those people were killed by Israel, even on accident, through friendly fire, through being confused about who was who. They're firing missiles, they're firing machine guns, and didn't really know exactly what was going on. So that's the first thing. When you're talking about like women and babies, some of the more awful things that we hear being repeated by our politicians are just false. I mean, they're just false when you look at the forensic evidence and who actually died. So it's.
Are you denying that women were raped on October 7th? Because that's true. The United Nations published a report saying that women were raped.
It's true that the United States, I'm sorry, the United Nations published a report discussing the possibility of sexual violence that happened on October 7th, but they actually weren't able to point to any particular incidents of rape. And so I'm not denying it insofar as that's certainly a possibility on a day of war, but to assert that this was like a systemic thing that happened is just not, it's not provable by the available evidence. And it's actually really damaging because it's continuing to, allow a genocide to occur.
All I'm saying is that like Hamas, if they wanted to like, get their point across, they could just do something else like peaceful protest. They didn't have to do this on October 7th.
I hear what you're saying. I think it's really difficult for any of us to put ourselves in the shoes of people who have been living under a kind of a slow genocide for 75 years and a fast one in the last 7 months. A number of the people in Hamas are orphans whose both their parents were murdered by Israeli military actions. I'm not going to condemn that. I can't put myself in those shoes.
So yeah, maybe we could form little groups and then you can talk about, introduce yourself and talk about any takeaways you got, and then just do like a little practice for later on when you're with your parents or something. And also maybe people on Zoom could, like choose someone to like do a little practice as well.
Yeah, good. I just had sort of one more thought that I noticed about Biden's video.
Yeah.
That he describes the cause of the violence as like some sort of generational hatred.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the one right up here.
Ancient desire.
I'll just think that I mean, it's pretty gross, but also just there's like a pretty good op-ed that was I don't remember, it was now this year or something like that, talking about how they're really like, even the violence that's committed is not committed because of like some sentiment of, anti-Semitism or something like that. It was just like, the violence is against the people who are dropping bombs on us. And so if those people were from an entirely different culture, or an entirely different place, or an entirely different race, that the violence would still exist. It's not some sort of like ancient hatred here. Violence that's being caused by violence, so it was the point of the op-ed. That's a very important contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. And the comment is that, to paraphrase, you were really eloquent, that you can't, Biden said that there's an ancient desire of Palestinian people to erase Jewish people off the planet, and that this is not metaphysical. This doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is specific reaction to being bombed, specific reaction to being enclosed in a concentration camp, specific reaction to, as Lina pointed to, numerous UN reports of credible accusations of sexual violence of Palestinians in Israeli detention. Right. It's not just this thing in the hearts of all these people because they're racist or because of their heritage or something. This is a material reaction to something that is happening in real life, and that's it's you can't really overstate that point. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, go ahead.
They got bombed and shot and treated to more violence. So they tried it several times and it's got terrible results.
Right. The comment is that when Palestinians have tried peaceful nonviolence, as in the Great March of Return in 2018, hundreds of people were killed. People marching up to the wall to demand the right to return to their original homes were intentionally shot in the kneecaps by Israeli snipers, dozens of them. And that was nonviolent. You know, they were burning tires, so it's a riot or something, but the tires were being burned to obscure the sniper's view of the people. Right, so thank you for bringing that up too. Yeah, and if we want to do some practice, or another thing that might be helpful is if we can even also just circle up and talk about like things that we have talked about with people that we have trouble getting around, or I know that like someone mentioned earlier a particular thing about a UN report, or I don't know what would be helpful, but we just wanted to have a little bit of space to like practice the conversations because they're going to keep happening. The US is also trying to foment war with Iran, with China, with Russia. And so like we're going to keep seeing more atrocity propaganda happen. And I think it's, I mean, we think as an organization that's really valuable to, in the communities that we're in, do our best to like push back against that in an empathetic way, in a gentle way, but in a firm way where we're like, that actually didn't happen. And that's important. There's political reasons why it's important that we know that didn't happen. Yeah. Yeah, let's take a quick vote. We're going to vote between forming small groups and doing this, or just circling up and kind of having a conversation about how to have the conversation. So raise your hand if you would like to get into small groups and kind of practice just having the kind of conversation that Luna and I had. Yeah, so if you have time, we have some food in the back. Yeah, we'll just circle up and talk a little bit about how we can have these conversations together. And if you can't stay, obviously, no pressure, but thank you very much for being here. And again, spending time on a really beautiful Sunday with us today. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. I'm gonna stop the recording now.